Today we will have a look at the many things we can explore with the new fade module from VCV. We have basically two inputs and two outputs and an X-fade or a crossfade knob that we can crossfade between them. And of course we have also CV control, which makes this module really fun. This video I guess is going to be a long one, but as always there are timestamp links in the description so you can jump around. Let's start. One of the basic ways we can use fade is to pan a voice left and right in the stereo field. Here I have a simple sequence, the sec3, sequencing the VCO, there is a filter, there is some modulation, and there is a delay. This is going to input 1 of the fade module, and you can see I have outputs 1 and 2 going to the left and right inputs on the mixer. Right, so if I unmute this is the sequence. Right, and now with the X-fade control I can pan it left and right. Right, and of course we have CV input, so why not exploring also some CV control. So here I have an LFO modulated by another LFO. I'm modulating the frequency with another LFO. So I can use this, for example, to pan the voice for me. I hope you are with headphones. Right, to this I'm going to add a nice bass with psych and the IO47 from Instruo. Let me unmute this. Oh yeah. And of course, we can also do this randomly with a random signal. So here I have the 12 key from Impromptu, so I can play a voice manually with the mouse in this case. This is a 2 oscillator voice. I have some noise going to a filter. And again, I'm sending this to input 1 on fade, and output 1 and 2 are going to the left and right channels. And in this case, I'm using a random. You can see the wave shape here on the scope, a random signal, a smooth random signal to pan this voice left and right. And I can play it now with a 12 key. Of course, the next step will be exploring this at audio rate, so audio rate panning, and this is a sort of amplitude modulation, I guess. I have here another simple sequence. In this case, I'm mixing a bit of a random source to change the notes here and there. Right, and again, this is going to input 1 on fade, output 1 and 2 are going to the left and right channel, so again, I can pan this, but in this case I'm going to do this at audio rates with another oscillator. Right, so the oscillator will go to the X-fade CV input. Now I can start adding modulation. To keep this sort of in tune and have the oscillators move together, I'm going to use the same pitch information. Right, this is without, and now with. Hear the changes. Of course, you can tune the oscillator differently. Something that might help you is the oct module from VCV, just to take this, explore different octaves. Oh. Right, another thing you can do is send this modulation first through a VCA, have an envelope, open this VCA to create more percussive feel to the sound. Right, so here I have a VCA and envelope. I'm going to send this modulation first through the VCA. So now I can control externally the amount of modulation, so the CV input can go all the way up. And I'm going to use the same gates for the envelope. And now we have something a bit more plucky. Right, to this I'm going to add some drums. I have here Zoom A sequencing Tremor 2 as a kick and hi-hat, Tremor, the original one, or Tremor 1 is a snare, and Kick All as a bass. We can also crossfade between waveforms and sounds. So here I have a sequence sequencing the VCO. I have some movement added with the oct module from VCV, just jumping in octaves up and down. I have a sine wave from this oscillator going to input 1 of fade, a saw wave to input 2. So I'm going to crossfade between a sine and a saw. And the output is going to a filter, and there is also some delay involved. Right, so all the way left it will be a sine, and all the way right it will be a saw, so I can crossfade to a saw wave. Right? And again we have CV control, so here I have an LFO that I'm sequencing its frequency with the oscillator. I have one row of the oscillator sequencing its frequency through the FM, so it will sound like this. Crossfading between sine and saw. Right, you can hear the movement if I take out the delay for a second. Right? Another thing you can try is crossfading between different sounds. So here I have Vesek and Kick All. Vesek is going to input 1, Kick All is going to input 2, and output 1 is going to tangents, right? So I have two different voices. Let me unmute this for a second. So this will be just Vesek, and this will be just Kick All. Right, and now I can crossfade between them, in this case with oct. I have another example. In this case I'm using the same sequence but two different oscillators. So I have the 16-step sequencer from Count Modular, sequencing once an oscillator with a saw wave, once an oscillator with a square wave, again cross-fading between them. In this case I'm using an envelope that is running with the clock division, so the envelope will open or will crossfade between the saw and the square with this clock division. Right, again I have a filter involved and some delay, which I'm by the way panning left and right with another fade module. Also here we can explore this at audio rates, and this technique is called wave splicing, basically morphing or switching between two different waveforms at audio rates. There are many ways you can approach this. In this case I have 3 oscillators. So let's say I will take a sine from one oscillator, right, this will be one output. Then let's say I will take a triangle from the second oscillator. Right, and then to crossfade between them at audio rates, I'm going to use a third oscillator. Let's use again a triangle. Right, and now the magic happens when we detune the oscillators or tune them to different relationships. Right, so let's say I will take the crossfading oscillator down, try to find a sweet spot. Sound. I can take one of the oscillators up, let's say the sine wave. Right, another interesting thing you can explore is using the crossfading oscillator using a square wave that has also pulse width control. So instead of crossfading, you basically hard switching between the waveforms. And now with the pulse width, you can change where the splicing will be. Right, and with this we can really explore different relationships of frequencies, create all sorts of different sounds and textures. Here I have a few examples. Here I'm wave splicing with 3 Blick oscillators from Volt, right? I have a sequence going with some slew limiting, so some portamento or glide. The pitch is going to all 3, so the relationship of the frequencies stays the same. Right, there's lots of modulation also coming from oct, so I'm wave splicing those 3 or those 2 oscillators with 3 Blick oscillators. This is going through a filter that I can control. If you have a look here, I can control it with my MIDI controller. Listen to this sound. There's also some delay involved here. Right, I have here another example for something a bit more percussive, a bit more snappy. I have again 3 oscillators. In this case, since fade has 2 inputs but also 2 outputs, right, I'm utilizing those 2 outputs, basically cross-fading between them. I have a sine and a saw, right? So it's not only cross-fading between the sine and saw, it will also cross-fade between the outputs, right? So I have a sort of a stereo voice in this case. I have spank making this a more percussive sound. There is some delay, lots of movement to sound like this. Another thing we can explore is cross-fading between 2 different voices or sounds that are not really related to one another, so 2 different sequences, 2 different ideas of sounds. Right here I have the Sec3 sequencing Opulus. There is some saturation here and a filter. And another voice I have here is noise going through a bandpass filter. Right, so totally unrelated voices. Right, and again I'm using X-fade, or I'm using fade to cross-fade between them. It will sound like this. Right, this is just Opulus. And this is just the noise. Right, but again, right, we can create a sort of a hybrid sound by cross-fading between them. In this case, I'm using an LFO, and I'm resetting the LFO just to get more rhythmic results. I have here some drums. I have Zoom A, sequencing again Tremor 2 and Tremor. There is a kick, there are hi-hats and a snare. And here I have another example. I have an FM operator running with a random sequence from a sample and hold, so random notes. And I have kick all running with a sort of a more stable sequence with the ADDR sequencer. Again, cross-fading between them with the fade module and an LFO. Another interesting thing to explore is using fade to send voices to different effects at certain times and in certain amounts. Here I have glass pane from a path set, sequencing kick all, it will sound like this. Right, and this is going to input 1 of the fade. Output 1 is going directly to the mixer, this is what we are hearing now. But output 2 is going to thorns and a delay. Thorns is sort of a saturation, and column lobe to a delay. Right, so now with the X fade control, if it's all the way to the left, we hear only the direct signal that goes directly to the mixer, but I can start sending it slowly to the delay. Right? And control how much of this signal will actually go to the delay. Right, and of course we can do this also with control voltage. So here I have an envelope being gated with the clock division. So only with this clock division, kick all will actually go to the delay. Just like this. I have here another example. This will work great for modules that don't have a mix control, but still you want to change how much of the voice will actually go to this module. So here I have basal, which will sound like this. Just a sine wave drone. Right, again, going to fade, and output 1 goes directly to the mixer. Output 2 goes to Wolf from Volt. It has no mix control, right? It's a wave shaper. From there it goes to Tap Dancer. But now I can control how much of basal will actually go to Wolf and Tap Dancer. And again, we can do this with control voltage. So here I have another envelope doing this. Let's stay with effects. We can crossfade between different effects, send one voice to multiple effects while crossfading, changing, scanning between them. Here I have Squonk, sequencing Tremor 2. By the way, I'm not so sure if I mentioned it already, but all of the patches will be available in the description. I used only 3 available modules, so all of you can download them and have a closer look or use them in your own productions. Right, so this is sequencing Tremor 2. Tremor 2 is going to input 1 of fade, and I have output 1 going to Tap Dancer and a compressor, so it will sound like this. Right, and output 2 is going to Chronoblob 2 with a really short delay, another compressor and the Briatus for some saturation, so it will sound like this. And again, I can crossfade, I can switch, I can change between them. And I have here an envelope that will do this for me. Right? I have here another example. I have here Entropia from the geodesics sequencing the VCO. Right, again, this is going to fade. I have output 1 going to Chronoblob 2. And output 2 is going to a sort of a wave destruction chain. I have here a comparator, a clock divider to get lower octaves. I'm mixing this into a filter, and this is going to a supercell for some granulization. And for crossfading between those two effects, between Chronoblob and the sort of a wave destruction chain, I'm using energy, also the geodesics. It can also be a complex LFO. And this is the wave shape that we get. So this will crossfade between the effects and it will sound like this. Let's move on now to control voltage. Fade is also DC coupled, which means that it can work also with CV, with modulation, with sequences, and so on. So here I have an LFO going to one input of fade. I have random modulation going to the other input. You can see this on the scope. I have output 1, which is the sine in this case, going to the scope, and also the random modulation, which is the blue trace. Right, I have the X fade all the way to the left. If I take it all the way to the right, the outputs will switch basically, and now the blue trace will be the LFO, and the green trace will be now the random voltage. Right, now I'm using this to open two different oscillators for two different filters, sorry, for two different oscillators, right, panned left and right, so it will sound like this. Right now, on the right, you should hear the sine wave modulation. On the left, on the left, the random modulation. If I switch between them or I fade between them, right now the sine wave will be on the left. And of course, again, we have CV control, so we can crossfade here with an LFO, create an interesting modulation source. You can see the result here on the scope. Right. Another example I have here. I have here Blick going through a VCA. There is also some delay, and I have an LFO, once an LFO and once an envelope, right, controlling this VCA. This is similar to what's on the new Moog Mavis. You can crossfade between an LFO and an envelope. Right, so this is what I'm doing here, crossfading between an LFO and an envelope. I have the LFO input 1, the LFO input 1, the envelope input 2, and one output is going to the VCA. And for crossfading between them, I'm using a sequencer through some slew limiting just to make this a bit smoother, the modulation a bit smoother. You can also see this here on the scope. This is the blue trace. We can also crossfade between sequences, not only modulation, and create a unique rhythmic result. Right here I have two sequences coming from the Sec3 going to fade. The result is going to a quantizer sequencing a voice. I have the VCO and chopping kinky with some modulation. Right, and I have an LFO crossfading between those two sequences. If I take the modulation out, right, so this will be sequence 1. This will be sequence 2. Right, and now we can create an interesting result cross-fading between them. Right? And of course you change the fade position, the CV amount, and also the rate of the LFO, you will get different results. However, another example, in this case I have two ADDR sequencers. One is running with a slower clock, right? So they are basically running at different rates. Again, cross-fading between them, in this case with smooth random modulation. This is sequencing rings. Have a listen to the rhythms, how sometimes there are more notes, less notes. So just like we can send two sequences to one voice, we can also send one sequence to two voices and morph between which voice is getting the sequence and how much of it. Right, so here I have a sequence coming from the count modular sequencer. It's going to input one of fade. From there it goes once to kick all. Of course, I'm using also a quantizer, and output 2 will go to Opolus, also a quantizer and some delay. Right, and I have smooth random modulation, basically morphing between which voice, kick-all or Opolus will get the sequence and how much of it. If I take out this modulation, this will be kick-all receiving the sequence, and Opolus, you can hear it static. And now just Opolus will get a sequence and kick-all will be static. Right, and now cross-fading between them with random voltage. Right, I also have here some drums. I have a kick, hi-hat, and a snare, right, coming from two tremors, and I have some delay. Now we have two inputs and two outputs on fade, so we can basically also send two sequences to two different voices, cross-fading between them, and here I'm doing exactly this. I have two sequences coming from the Sec3 and two FM operators that I'm going to switch or cross-fade between, again with smooth random signals. Right, I have here another example with two 5-step sequences and two kick-all voices, again cross-fading between them. This will create something a bit more chaotic. This will work great also with trigger sequences and rhythmic sequences. Right, I have here two sequences coming from the trigger sequencer from count modular, going to input 1 and 2 on the fade module. And I have output 1 triggering a kick drum, output 2 triggering a hi-hat. It will sound like this. Right, if I crossfade to the other side, they will switch the rhythms. Right, and again, I can use something like an LFO to crossfade between the rhythms. Right, I have here, this is going also to tap dancer for a nice delay. Right, here I have another example. I have two Euclidean sequencers set differently, of course, cross-fading between them and between two different voices, so where those sequences will go. I have once kick-all, once Opolus, both set with a sort of a bass sound. So this is kick-all, this is Opolus. I want to show you quickly a few more uses of the fade module. The first one is as a mixer. So here I have two oscillators, right? I have a saw going to input 1 of fade, and I have a square which is an octave down going to input 2. Right, all the way to the left with fade will be just a saw, all the way to the right will be just a square, right? But somewhere in the center, we can mix those two waves, right? So we can use fade also as a mixer. This will work also, of course, for CV. Right here I have two LFOs that I can use to modulate the filter. Right, and I can mix them basically again with the X fade control and create a unique modulation source. Another use is as a VCA. So here I have a saw wave, right, going through a filter, and it's going to input 1 on fade, but I have output 2 going to a delay and to the mixer. So when the X fade control is all the way left, no sound will come through. When I start taking it to the right, we start hearing the sound. And of course I can use, since it has a CV control, I can use something like an envelope, right, to control this and have it as a sort of a VCA. Right, I can add some modulation also to the filter. Now, if you are not using something like a sine wave or a triangle wave to fade between two different signals, if you use something like a square wave or a gate, you can hard switch between the signals and basically use fade as a switch, right? So for example, you can use it as a 2-to-1 switch, switching between two different sources to one destination. Here I have two different sequences. I'm switching between them, and this is going to one destination, to an oscillator. And for switching, I'm using basically a clock division, which is a gate. So again, it will just hard switch between the signals and it will sound like this. Right, switching between the sequences. So this is a 2-to-1 switch. Here we can use it also as a 1-to-2. So one source, in this case it's a sequence, to two different destinations. In this case, those are two different voices. And again, I'm using a clock division to switch between them. I have one fade for pitch and one fade for gates, switching between, again, the two sequences, or the two voices actually in this case. Right, so it's one sequence and I'm switching between the different voices. And of course, we can use it also as a 2-to-2 switch. So two sources switching between two destinations. I have two sequences and two oscillators, again using a clock division to switch between the signals. Another fun thing to explore is feedback loops. Here I have a sequence sequencing the FM operator. It's going to input one of the fade module, and the output is going to a delay and to the mixer. It will sound like this. But I have the wet output of the delay. If you don't have a wet output, you can use again the mix output. But the wet output is going to tangents, a bandpass filter with modulation, and to another delay with shorter times. And this here is going to input two of the fade, right? So now I can cross fade between the different chains, and all of this is going back to the main delay, right? So it's feeding back to the delay, creating an interesting effect. You can use all sorts of different modules and chains in this feedback loop, and just watch your levels. But let's listen to how this will sound like. Now, fade is also polyphonic, so you can create all sorts of different effects by utilizing polyphony. Here I have the note sec from JW, creating chords, sequencing polyphonically the VCO. Right, this is going to fade again as a polyphonic voice, and fade is going to the left and right channels. Right, so now I can pan all of this chord left and right. Or I can use modulation from an LFO. But if I take this LFO and make it also polyphonic and I offset each of the voices of the LFO, I offset their frequency, each of the voices of the oscillator will have a different panning movement, right? So I can use something like Polycon 8 from Bog Audio just to add offset to the different channels of the LFO. And now I have a listen. I hope you are with headphones. Right, I can offset each of the voices of this chord, and you can do all sorts of different things with it, not just panning. Everything we looked at today can be done also polyphonically. Just for fun, I'm sending this through a reverb and some distraction here with the plateau and the Briatus. Right, this was it. Thank you for watching. I hope this was somewhat helpful. Go explore fade even further. Cheers.